universities. And in 2018, the University of Glasgow published a report titled Slavery, Abolition and the University of Glasgow. Now, this report acknowledged that despite a strong abolitionist stance in the 18th and 19th centuries, the university continued to further its institutional goals through the acceptance of gifts and bequests from people who profited from chattel slavery. Now, in response to this, the Hunterian developed a project called Curating Discomfort, and it was a project to explore the interpretation of contested collections and to find new forms of collaboration between academics and community stakeholders to do this work. Now, apart from the title, there was nothing particularly unusual about the project. Other museums and galleries across Scotland had previously run projects looking at reinterpreting their collections in light of colonial history. And the motivation behind a lot of this work is to engage with wider audiences that are historically underrepresented and rarely visit museums. Essentially, they recognise that Black and minority ethnic communities in Glasgow rarely visited the Hunterian. So for me, as an anti-racist activist, when I applied for the post, I put forward to the Hunterian an alternative approach to the delivery of Curating Discomfort, one that not only produced a visible public-facing outcome, but also an exploration of the ideologies that perpetuated the inequalities and prejudices that persist today. So this is most notable in relation to Black and minority ethnic people, who are those most impacted by the legacies of empire, slavery, colonialism and migration. So I took on the role of Curator of Discomfort in September 2020 as an 18-month secondment from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, an organisation that tackles structural racism in Scotland. And the Curating Discomfort project draws on the evidence and experience of inequality and racism in Scotland. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is the case study of the Curating Discomfort project. I will offer a brief description of the interventionist process undertaken at the Hunterian, and hopefully we'll have time for any questions at the end. So Curating Discomfort, the motivation. The Macpherson report in 1999 was prompted by racially motivated murder of Stephen Lawrence, which caused a widespread debate about policing and racism in Britain. Now, the report highlighted the existence of institutional racism and inequality in all areas of society. And section 2.19 read, radical thinking and sustained action are needed to tackle it head on, not just in the police services of our country, but in all organisations and in particular in the fields of education and family life. So the inclusion of education, culture and heritage institutions in the report meant that the authors, they recognised that they had to update the policy in line with amended legislation, but also to explore culture, national heritage and identity with a more critical eye. And back in 1999, the Macpherson report noted that radical thinking needs to be accompanied by sustained action, and this had an impact on museums, inviting community groups to get involved. Now, I think it's important to start at that place around the motivation and thinking about 1999, because while museums are really engaging with a lot of this work, this has been a long time coming. And the slide that I have here, when I think about the motivation, particularly as an anti-racist activist, this you will find on the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights website. So I would recommend that you go in and look at all the work they've been doing for over 20 years around Black history in Scotland. And when we think about it, in Scotland, the personal and specific historical context belonging to people of African, Caribbean and Asian descent link them to the legacies of empire, transatlantic slavery, colonialism and migration. Now, each of these injustices has had an extensive impact on Scotland's economic, demographic, environmental, cultural and social development. Now, despite this, the histories of these communities are not acknowledged and represented as well as they should be within history, heritage, arts and culture work in Scotland today. Now, museums hold collections that have a direct link to this history, yet do not always recognise or understand the legacy of past human rights violations and how they have a link to current social systems that continue to impact negatively on Scotland's Black minority ethnic communities. So while community engagement exercises within museums are welcome, there are issues of the lack of equity involved in the power relationships between museums and the community groups they work with. They are often set up as a volunteer opportunity, creating a power dynamic in which knowledge and experience are held by museum professionals, where the volunteers' knowledge and experience are just not that professional enough to recompense financially. Now, at times this can manifest as exploitation, and where community engagement projects can be valuable to those who participate, the lack of structural change within museums means that they can continue to institutionally ignore the integral role that empire has played in shaping their approaches to their history. So Curating Discomfort looked at what defines a community, and it ways outside of traditional structures of museum authority to challenge existing models of practice. And this was done in the hope of changing the power relationships between the museum and the communities that they serve. To explore the interpretations of contested collections, we set out to design and deliver a series of museum interventions that took the museum out of its institutional comfort zone. And at the centre of this was exploring white supremacy as an economic and cultural system in which white Western ideas control the power of the text, the material resources, and ideas of cultural superiority. So phase one, so I'm going to show you a small animation, but before I show you the animation, I'll just talk through, again, the interventionist process. Phase one, museum intervention internally. So while current discourse in museums is looking at decolonisation, what that means in practice goes far beyond changing a display. Discomfort is necessary for meaningful change, and to begin, we delivered a workshop for museum professionals across Scotland. We explored the concepts of different races and racial groups and the false notions of racial superiority that were developed during the 18th, 19th and early 20th century. Now, these ideologies were used to justify chattel slavery, looting and violent endeavours in the name of empire. We then explored structural racism in the present day, how false notions of racial and cultural superiority still have an influence in all areas of life in Scotland, from ingrained social attitudes to the way organisations are run, and each permitting inequalities for Black and minority ethnic people to continue over generations. It can be seen on a personal level in people's attitudes and behaviours, on a social level on how people talk to each other and make decisions, and on an institutional level on how organisations conduct their business. So I'm going to show you this short animation because this is the product from the workshops working with museum professionals across Scotland, and it's their response to it, so it's their words. It's just under 3 minutes long, okay? Okay, so that was all the phase one of the project. And then looking into phase two, as part of the actions and practical steps for change from the workshop, we recognise that organisational change is required, and we acknowledge that the infrastructure must be in place if museums want to work with external community groups in a meaningful way. So the Hunterian recently developed and published a new strategic plan for 2021-25, which emphasises moving towards becoming a more ethical museum that welcomes the knowledge, experience and perspective of communities to co-curate with equity. And we developed a Curating Discomfort library for staff to reference when researching collections, as well as for continued professional development and anti-racist practice. So this took us to phase three. So we had 6 months left of the project. And as part of the project commitment with the funders was to have some sort of visible output. So we had to hit the ground running, and remember this is also through a pandemic, so I don't need to go into the details of that for everybody because we were all having experiences around that. What I did do was invite 6 individuals to be part of the Curating Discomfort team. They're not all in that photograph, but they are a group of people from different geographical and ethnic backgrounds who have lived in Glasgow for different lengths of time. They are academics, community activists, social justice campaigners and educators, and they came to this work as individuals with a wide range of interests and priorities. And over the 6 months, we operated as a community. We met fortnightly with occasional visits inside the museum to critically assess the displays. And from this progress, we developed a set of 5 key messages. 1, the Hunterian collection is relevant to addressing historic legacies. 2, large parts of the Hunterian collections are in Glasgow, Scotland, because of global networks of imperial extraction and exploitation. 3, objects in the Hunterian collection have historic and symbolic value for many people, not least the source communities who have previously been ignored and overlooked and excluded. 4, objects can be interpreted from multiple perspectives, and there is never just one narrative about an object. 5, the current displays are only one moment in an ongoing process and not a conclusion. So alongside the community creators, the wider project team of museum staff produced a film discussing the process of collaboration, highlighting the difficulties, the discomfort and the positive outcomes from the process. It is usual practice in museums to highlight the positive outcomes of a project. However, transparency in the process is especially essential about discomfort and difficult element to this work if we want to sustain change. So if you've not actually been in the museum to see the intervention, please go along, because the film between the community creators and the Hunterian staff is on display there, and it's really interesting hearing what people thought. So one of the things they discuss is what I've got on the slide here is a graphic. I'm very visual, and when we set up a conversation where the community creators were having a discussion, and I like using visuals to record that discussion. And again, this you'll see in the intervention in the Hunterian. And the film talks about the experience for the Hunterian staff and the community creators of that discussion. So coming to the end, Creating Discomfort as an intervention, not an exhibition. In April 2022, the Creating Discomfort intervention was launched. This was a new high-profile intervention in the displays of the Hunterian main hall in the Gilbert Scott building. The intervention is the visible public-facing outcome of the Curating Discomfort project, funded through a grant from Museums Galleries Scotland with additional support from the Hunterian's own endowments. Curating Discomfort sought to restore social capital appropriated through 2 centuries of collecting to local and international communities. It also sought to ensure that the Hunterian's own internal processes undergo fundamental and permanent realignment around race and equality issues. The project delivered impacts beyond the Hunterian, facilitating new critical strategic dialogues at senior levels across the University of Glasgow and Scotland's cultural sector and beyond. Now, the interventions in the displays are intended to put forward discomfort and provocations and interventions that help visitors and those involved in the museum sector to understand that our institutions have perpetuated ideologies of white supremacy. And working with a team of community creators, the new intervention explicitly challenged the voices and ideologies that underpin the displays that have been in place at the Hunterian since the museum marked its bicentenary in 2007. So as the oldest public museum in Scotland, the development of the Hunterian is deeply rooted in Scotland's complex history, a history that has led to multiple inequalities and prejudices that persist today, most notably in relation to race. And what I've got up on the screen here is the first label that you will actually see, a declaration of discomfort. Again, if you visit the intervention at the Hunterian, you'll be able to interact with that.